Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cummings, and the other members of the committees. My wife and I are the very proud father of Evan Badish, who's a 25-year-old son with autism who attends Marshall University, which, like the other school represented on this panel, is thriving and helping so many with autism. But he is one of the more fortunate with autism. The Autism Society of America is the nation's largest and oldest grassroots organization dedicated to the autism spectrum. As has been discussed today, the incidence of autism has shown marked increases in CDC surveillance rates, currently at 1 out of 88 births. Many children and adults may not be properly diagnosed, and this number may actually be higher than the actual incidence. We applaud the work of the CDC and appreciate the partnership we have with the CDC, and particularly efforts we are working with the CDC on addressing better some of the questions asked earlier about how we can increase the growing disparity of the autism diagnosis rates among people of color and other ethnicities and geographic location. We would suggest that currently the services for autism are difficult at best to navigate, and often when services are provided, they may not be individualized or be the best approach for the needs of the individual. The Autism Society is about helping people today and preparing them for tomorrow, and we believe that government services, if funded by government dollars, should have focus on advancing an individual's quality of life in measurable and meaningful ways. We need to re-examine how government services can be provided, not on a limited definition of services, but rather based on an individual's needs. As I noted today, there is a significant disparity in the need for available funds for both long-term and to support people with disabilities. This disparity has resulted in very long waiting lists for services throughout our country, and estimates have that waiting list being anywhere from 80,000 individuals nationally to as many as 200,000 people who go without services each day. Meeting this significant need will not only require expansion of services, but we believe it requires us as a society and government to think differently about the way services are delivered. An individual today who's diagnosed ineligible for services and then put on a waiting list is denied the critical services that we all know could help him or her move forward in addressing quality of life needs. We recognize that funds are limited, and we would encourage the committee to examine ways that if funds have to be cut, that they not be cut at the expense of individuals, but at the expense of unnecessarily duplication and administrative services. We also would encourage this committee in its role to look at the public schools. Public schools are required by law to provide every child with an appropriate education, and unfortunately 50% of students with disabilities are either dropping out or not graduating or not receiving appropriate degrees. This is very difficult when we look at how to help those children in adult life. We also believe that government services must be outcome-based, and we must encourage that those services aim to help a person maximize his or her independence and self-sufficiency. And we also have to take a recognition that as a nation, while we are very concerned about an unemployment rate when it goes above 5 or 6%, the reality is that for the individuals with people with disabilities, that rate is as high as 78.5%. Government's response are most effective also when resources are available under one umbrella, and any parent or any individual who has had to navigate the system will say it's impossible to navigate. The committee needs to also look at how we can more effectively, and we would argue at a much lower cost, coordinate the government's response through a one-stop model or a centralization of information. We also would encourage this committee to look at the issue of Medicaid portability. When a person moves from one state to another, he or she loses their Medicaid community support services and has to start over again. This is particularly of concern to military families when they get relocated from one base to another. Finally, I want to mention about the Combating Autism Act and the Interagency Coordinating Council. With all respect to our prior speaker, we would disagree with a lot of what he said. This is a group that in concept could do a great job of coordination, but in reality it's not. If a body is going to be in fact a coordinating body, it has to include public, private and not-for-profit sectors, and we have to be an equal partner at the table. It also has to include government representatives from the Department of Labor, Justice, Housing and Defense. And it also has to meet. We also support very strongly and encourage the continued funding of training components of the Combating Autism Act. Finally, I would just like to encourage that, as said prior to all this, the need for adult service is extensive. When you talk about a fiscal cliff, the greatest cliff that occurs in our community is that when a person turns 21 and absolutely no services are available for that person when they need. And again, we thank the committee, and I'll be happy to answer any questions when all the other speakers are over.
Thank you, Mr. Badish. Mr. Wright, did you just have one quick point?
A piece of information just came to my attention. The Senate just passed the TRICARE Amendment, restoring all military personnel ABA therapy, whether retired or in service. It's taken 5 years to do that. 5 years.
Mr. Blacksall, you are now recognized for your testimony. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm honored to be here to represent Safe Minds, grateful to the chairman and to Congressman Burton for his terrific work. And I'm humbled by the opportunity to represent the community of autism families. I would like to enter into the record. We've collected testimonials in the last couple of days from over 300 autism families who wanted to attend the hearing but could not. And you can read their statements here.
Without objection, so ordered. We will include that in the record.
I wrote a book on autism. It argues that autism is a new condition. In 1935, Leo Kanner wrote this book. It's 537 pages long, not a whisper of autism in any of it. 3 years later, he saw the first child with autism, a family from Mississippi that came all the way up to visit him, and he'd never seen a child like Donald Triplett before. In 1943, he wrote his famous paper in which he argued, since 1938, there have come to our attention a number of children whose condition differs so markedly and uniquely from anything reported so far that each case merits a detailed consideration of its fascinating peculiarities. Before 1930, the rate of autism in the world and in America was effectively zero. Today, nearly 70 years after Conner's paper, reported autism rates are 1 in 88. In New Jersey, 1 in 29 boys born in 2000 were diagnosed as autistic. What's going on? Why are so many American children sick? I think we have to face reality. We need to be clear. Autism is a public health crisis of historic proportions, worse than poliomyelitis. It's devastating a generation of children and their families. We need to face that reality. Autism is a national emergency. Could we skip to slide 5? There's a summary here of historical autism surveys in America. For a long time, we had low rates in America, about 1 in 10,000. Keep flipping. There we go. Then around 1990, something new and terrible happened to a generation of children. Autism rates didn't just rise, they multiplied. This escalation covered both full syndrome autism and the broader autism spectrum, including Asperger's. Some people claim this isn't real, that we're just doing better diagnosing. That's just wrong. If you read the old literature, the old surveys, they looked for everybody, and they couldn't find people. They didn't miss 99% of the children with autism. It's not hard to find a child with autism. It's obvious when they're autistic. The notion that we're just doing better diagnosing, even in the CDC studies, they're using the same methodology. So when you see those numbers rising, that's not because the methods are changing, it's because there are more cases. In the midst of this crisis, the federal agencies responsible for the health of our children have failed in their duty. CDC's negligence has led the way. Many of us believe CDC has actively covered up evidence surrounding autism's environmental causes. NIH, meanwhile, has received the lion's share of funding, money they've wasted on status quo research and gene studies. It's absurd to focus on genetic research in this crisis. There's no such thing as a genetic epidemic. I'll skip past a couple of examples of malfeasance. I'll just say that in the financial world, the result of pressure to manipulate numbers to provide the answers that bosses want has a name. It's called securities fraud. In medicine, there are similar pressures. They're called special interest politics and even peer review. And what CDC has given us is the medical equivalent of securities fraud, all to avoid the inconvenient reality of the autism epidemic. In the face of a national emergency, government agencies, especially CDC and NIH, have performed poorly and behaved badly. We need accountable new leadership on autism at NIH and CDC. We need an advisory committee that believes in combating autism, not newly stocked with appointees who actually oppose that mission. We need a Combating Autism Act that truly combats autism. We need to stop investing in the autism gene hunt and identify what has changed in the environment that it could possibly have injured so many children. The scope and the magnitude of these changes. It's complicated, yes, but it can't be that complicated. There have to be a very small list of things that could have changed. Ultimately, we need to face and answer the question, why are so many children sick? We'll only do that hard work if agency leaders are held accountable to the American people, not powerful interests in the medical industry. So we're asking you, the members of the committee, for your help. Please, let's not make this hearing a one-time episode. Please stay on the job in the next Congress. Root out the failures, the waste, the fraud, the negligence, and the abuse in these agencies that aren't doing their job. We need CDC and NIH to do their jobs, and they're not. There's a crisis. We need your help. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Blaxall. Mr. McGarry, you are now recognized for your testimony.